The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term.
The U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos.
Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA.
The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term. U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, alcohol, dairy, and energy. All three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA. It didn't begin with a speech or a press briefing. It began with a list. The kind of list that usually gets worked out quietly behind closed doors. Except this time, every item on it hit like a pressure point. And within 24 hours, Mark Carney had already decided that none of it was worth negotiating. Which is why when Donald Trump's team expected a counteroffer, they got something far more disruptive instead. A complete rejection of all five demands at once. Not softened, not postponed, not wrapped in diplomatic wording, just a clear signal that Canada wasn't going to negotiate from a place of fear this time. And that single decision is what quietly turned a routine trade review into one of the most significant economic standoffs North America has seen in decades. What makes this moment different isn't the demands themselves, but the sequence in which the pressure unfolded. Because before Washington even formalized its stance, Canada had already started reinforcing the exact sectors those demands would later target, locking in policies, passing legislation, and building alternatives in a way that suggests this response was never reactive. It was prepared well ahead of time. Which is why when Jamieson Greer stood before Congress and outlined the conditions for extending the agreement another 16 years, the expectation in Washington was that at least one or two will be negotiable. But instead, every single one ran into a system that had already been reinforced against change. Take energy, which strangely wasn't presented as a first issue by Washington, even though it underpins the entire relationship. Because the United States currently imports about 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per day from Canada, making up roughly 23% of total American refinery feedstock, with Gulf Coast refineries specifically designed to process Canadian heavy sour crude. A detail that rarely makes headlines but defines a reality of dependence. And during winter peaks, New England quietly relies on Canadian electricity imports to keep homes warm and the grid stable. Meaning the energy relationship isn't a favor, it's a necessity, and that imbalance sits beneath every other demand, whether acknowledged or not. Now, layer that reality against what Washington actually requested. Starting with dairy, where American producers have long argued that Canada's supply management system blocks fair competition by imposing tariffs between 200 and 298% on imports beyond fixed quotas, which on paper looks like protectionism, but in practice is a system that stabilizes domestic production and protects thousands of farms, especially in Quebec. And what changed this time is that Canada didn't just defend the system rhetorically. It passed legislation that permanently safeguards supply management, effectively removing it from the negotiating table altogether. Meaning, even if Ottawa wanted to concede, the law itself now prevents it, turning what used to be a bargaining chip into a structural constant. That same pattern appears in digital media, where Canada's Online Streaming Act, Music, and Online News Act require platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube to reinvest a portion of their Canadian revenue into local content and compensate publishers for news distribution. Policies that Washington described as discriminatory toward American tech firms, but which Canada views as essential for cultural survival in a market dominated by U.S. platforms. And what makes this clash more significant is the scale of money involved, because these rules redirect billions in revenue streams. Meaning the debate isn't just about fairness. It's about who controls the narrative, the content pipeline, and ultimately the cultural identity of a country sitting next to the world's largest media machine. Then comes the issue of government procurement, where Washington accused provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia of favoring domestic suppliers, demanding equal access for American companies. But that argument weakens when you consider that the United States enforces by American policies across federal contracts, military spending, and infrastructure projects, often with strict domestic sourcing requirements. Which is why Carney's refusal here wasn't just strategic. It was almost unavoidable. Because conceding would mean abandoning a policy that even the U.S. itself depends on to protect its own industries. The alcohol dispute might seem small on the surface, but it exposes a sequencing issue that defines this entire conflict, because several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine only after U.S. tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods, making those bans a direct response rather than an independent policy. And Washington's demand to lift them without removing its own tariffs essentially asked Canada to stop defending itself while the pressure stayed in place. A proposal that doesn't function as negotiation so much as compliance, which explains why it was rejected just as quickly as the others. And yet, the most revealing part of this entire situation is what wasn't aggressively targeted. Because automobiles, despite being the most integrated and economically critical sector in North America, were noticeably absent from the core demands. Even though everyone involved understands that the auto industry operates as a single system where parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly, with Canadian factory producing components for American vehicles and U.S. plants supplying engines for Canadian production lines. A network that saves tens of billions of dollars annually through efficiency and scale. And when Mark Rouse explained to Congress just how complex and interconnected these supply chains are, it became clear that disrupting the system would hurt American manufacturers as much as, if not more than, Canadian ones. That silence around autos wasn't accidental. It was strategic, because Washington knows that pushing too hard in that sector risks destabilizing companies that are already warning about the consequences, especially after tariffs under Section 232 were imposed on steel, aluminum, and vehicles, which have already strained the system. And now those same companies are pushing for stability, not escalation, effectively placing pressure on the administration from within its own industrial base. But the real turning point didn't happen in Washington, Ottawa. It happened when Carney started expanding outward instead of negotiating inward, particularly with his move toward China, where targeted agreements on canola, electric vehicles, and agricultural exports created what he described as friendly nation tariffs. Not a full trade deal, but enough to reopen markets that had been restricted. And when Trump initially praised the move before reversing calls and threatening 100% tariffs if Canada became a drop-off point for Chinese goods, the response from Ottawa was immediate clarification that no free trade agreement was being pursued and no existing clauses were being violated. A position later confirmed in direct talks between Dominic LeBlanc and Greer himself. What that moment really showed is that Canada is no longer negotiating from a single axis, because every alternative trade route, every reopened export channel, and every new partnership reduces reliance on the United States, which historically accounted for nearly 75% of Canadian exports. A dependency that defined decades of economic policy, but one that is now gradually being reduced through diversification. Whether it's agricultural access to China, expanding European ties, or domestic procurement policies redirecting roughly $70 billion toward Canadian suppliers. And this is where the narrative flips, because what looks like defiance on the surface is actually leverage underneath, since each of the 5 demands reveals not just what Washington wants, but what it lacks. Whether it's dairy access showing the need for Canadian consumers, digital media complaints highlighting lost revenue for U.S. tech firms, or procurement disputes exposing how effectively Canada is keeping capital within its own economy, turning what was meant as pressure into a kind of unintended transparency. What makes the timing of all this even more critical is that the trade agreement itself is approaching a structural checkpoint, with 3 possible outcomes on the table as July approaches. Either a full extension for another 16 years, a complete withdrawal by one side, or a shift into annual reviews that would stretch uncertainty all the way to 2036. And while many analysts assume Canada will eventually accept revised terms to avoid disruption, that assumption is based on an older version of the country where economic survival depended almost entirely on access to American markets, not the current version that has spent the past few years quietly expanding its options in multiple directions at once. You can see that shift clearly in how global audiences reacted when Carney stepped onto the stage of the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered a speech that didn't mention the United States directly, but reframed the entire conversation around economic sovereignty. warning that middle powers that fail to assert themselves risk becoming subordinate to larger economies, and using that now widely quoted line that countries not seated at the table end up on the menu, a message that resonated across Europe and the Indo-Pacific, where concerns about economic coercion are already rising. And while some in Washington dismissed it, including Scott Bessent, who called it virtue signaling, the broader reaction suggested something else entirely, that Canada was positioning itself as part of a wider coalition rather than a bilateral dependency. At the same time, the internal messaging from Washington has been anything but consistent, because while Trump has publicly questioned the value of the agreement, even suggesting it has outlived its usefulness, Greer's own testimony to Congress painted a very different picture, citing $960 billion in U.S. export to Canada and Mexico under the deal and a 56% increase in exports since its implementation. Numbers that don't align with the idea of irrelevance. And when nearly 150 American industry leaders, including representatives from steel, energy, agriculture, and automotive sectors, urged continuation of the agreement, it became clear that the business community sees stability not as optional but essential. That contradiction is where the real pressure begins to build, because no administration spends months outlining detailed demand for an agreement it truly believes doesn't matter. And the more Washington pushes, the more it reveals just how much is at stake domestically, particularly in industries that depend on cross-border integration. Whether it's auto manufacturers managing complex supply chains, energy companies dependent on Canadian imports, or agricultural exporters seeking stable access to northern markets. And yet, instead of escalating rhetorically, Carney's approach has been to keep building quietly in the background, strengthening domestic procurement strategies, aligning provincial and federal priorities, especially between Ontario and Ottawa on automotive production, and positioning Canada's critical minerals as essential to the United States' ambitions in clean energy and artificial intelligence, sectors that will define the next decade of industrial competition. Meaning the leverage isn't just about current trade flows. It's about future dependencies that are only beginning to emerge. Even the diplomatic tension has unfolded in a way that unintentionally strengthened Canada's position. Like when Trump invited Carney to join a high-profile international initiative and then publicly withdrew the invitation after the Davos speech, a move clearly intended to apply pressure, but instead raised Carney's profile on the global stage, turning what could have been a setback into a demonstration of independence and reinforcing the perception that Canada is willing to absorb short-term friction in exchange for long-term strategic positioning. Meanwhile, every unresolved demand continues to act as a spotlight on the underlying dynamics of the relationship. Because the dairy dispute highlights agricultural interdependence, the digital media conflict underscores the financial scale of content control, the procurement debate exposes competing philosophies on domestic protection, and the energy conversation reveals a level of reliance that cannot be easily replaced, especially when infrastructure and refining capacity are built around specific supply sources. So when you hear that 5 demands were rejected, it's easy to frame it as defiance or even risk. But when you examine the structure behind those decisions, the legislation that locks certain policies in place, the alternative markets being developed, the domestic investments being redirected, the international relationships being strengthened, it starts to look less like a gamble and more like a calculated shift toward a different kind of economic model. One that prioritizes flexibility over dependence and leverage over accommodation. And the real question now isn't whether the standoff continues, because in many ways it already has. It's how each side adapts to the new reality it has helped create. Whether Washington recalibrates its approach to preserve an agreement that clearly benefits its own industries, or whether it continues pushing in a way that accelerates the very diversification it's trying to counter. Whether Canada can maintain this balance long enough to fully establish the alternatives it has begun building, turning temporary leverage into permanent structural advantage. Let me know what you think, because this is one of those moments where the next move could change everything. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next.